Welcome to Michigan's World War I Centennial News Report for January 2015. World War I Poetry. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. We're going to examine World War I poets from the battlefield and also from the home front. One century ago, on January 12, 1915, the United States House of Representatives rejected a proposal to give women the right to vote. On January 21, 1915, the Supreme Lodge Benevolent Order of Brothers was formed. The name was changed a year later to Kiwanis. The Kiwanis Club of Detroit was the original club of the Kiwanis. By 1927, the organization had more than 100,000 members. Kiwanis became international in 1916 with the formation of a club in Hamilton, Ontario. The original purpose of the Kiwanis was to exchange business between members and to serve the poor. On January 24, 1915, the Battle of Dogger Bank was fought in the North Sea between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet. Decoded radio intercepts had given the British advanced knowledge that a German raiding squadron was heading for Dogger Bank, so they dispatched their own naval forces to intercept it. The British found the Germans at the expected time and place. Surprised, the smaller and slower German squadron fled for home. During the stern chase, which lasted several hours, the British slowly caught up with the Germans and engaged them in long-range fire. The British disabled the Blucher, the rear German ship, but the Germans put the British flagship HMS Lion out of action with heavy damage. Due to a signaling mix-up, the remaining British ships broke off pursuit of the fleeing enemy force to sink the Blucher. By the time this had been done, the German squadron had escaped. All the remaining German vessels returned safely to harbor, though some had heavy damage requiring extended repairs. On January 25, 1915, the first United States coast-to-coast long-distance telephone call was made, facilitated by a newly invented vacuum tube amplifier. The call was between Alexander Graham Bell in New York City and his former assistant Thomas A. Watson in San Francisco. The phone call took 23 minutes to set up and involved the services of 5 telephone operators.
There was a tremendous widespread writing of poetry in World War I for a variety of reasons, and these war poets were people that were experiencing war at first hand. When I start to think of why World War I was considered the poetry war, I think of the context. Before World War I, poetry about war was typically written by those who were not involved in the war, who were not involved in the battles, so that it was very different in character. Alfred Lord Tennyson, for instance, in Britain, was poet laureate for decades, and he writes the famous poem, Charge of the Light Brigade. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Bravely they fought and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. But he writes that 6 weeks after the war, it's in the Crimea, the Battle of Balaclava, of which he wrote, and he was off in England, and a very different sense. Now, when the war poet starts to be used, and it was first used of a German poet in the middle of the 19th century, but it becomes very broadly used of poets during World War I, that has the effect of, here are people who have first-hand experience of the war. This may be soldiers, and soldiers, both rank and file, were involved in that writing, and so it takes on the grit and the dirt and the mud and the blood of the war in a very different sense. A poem written by T.S. Down in Alma, Michigan, or over in Alma, Michigan, in early September 1914. Now this is just 5 weeks after hostilities start. Now this is a poem about an issue of the war, but this person would not be considered a war poet. He writes saying, fair play, come, let's have justice, let's have fair play. To all our armed brothers in the fatherland, the quality of brute and vandal, please. And he's making a plea for people recognizing that England and France, and he even says Ireland, have been imperialists as well, and why call that specially out for the Germans in this particular war. And he says 25 millions of Teutonic blood here in the States cry out, brothers, fair play. 25 millions pledged to your defense. Columbia against all foreign foes. E'en in Germany cry out, hands off, 'tis not our fight. Stand off, let's have fair play. And of course, much more famous than T.S., whoever T.S. may be, is Edgar Guest, who wrote for the Detroit Free Press. In fact, he was involved with the Detroit Free Press for 65 years. And he writes poems about the war, but they are painted over with scenes of America, so that even when he's writing of the soldier's experience, he writes the things that make a soldier great and send him out to die, to face the flaming cannon's mouth, nor ever question why, are lilacs by a little porch, the row of tulips red, the peonies and pansies too, the old petunia bed, the grass plot where his children play, the roses on the wall, 'tis these that make the soldier great. He's fighting for them all. The context is home front pictures, and yet very, very different from what happens during the war. You know about the film The Wipers' Times, the common word used by many speaking English about the Belgian town Ypres, based on a frontline newspaper of the same name that was one of many such newspapers. There was the Psalms Time, there was the British Expeditionary Force Times, and by the second month, to give you an indication of how widespread poetry was among all levels of the troop, the editor writes, "We regret to announce that an insidious disease is affecting the division, and the result is a hurricane of poetry. Subalterns have been seen with a notebook in one hand and bombs in the other, absently walking near the wire in deep communion with the muse of poetry." And skipping down to the last line, "The editor would be obliged if a few of the poets would break into prose, as a paper cannot live by poems alone." And so you get the feeling that it's one of amazement even in their time. Part of this was that newspapers were available. Newspapers were being published near the front, but the English nurses talk about getting the newspaper, the London Times, the next day after it was published. Many of the local newspapers were around, and people would send their poems that could pass the censors into the newspapers, and they might be published, and there would be a feeling of recognition for what they were doing, for what they were saving. So that you ask why, and I start to think of several reasons. First of all, it's really the first major war when most of the soldiery, at least on the Western Front, was literate. They were in schools, they could read, they could write, and were encouraged to do so. And it was an age that honored poetry. people memorized poetry back in those days, far less so now. And then with censorship. All of the letters were censored, and all of the books that were written at that time. So you could not talk about many names. Just like in any war, you could not talk about units that were going forward. Trains were numbered, whether they were hospital trains or other trains, and the numbers would be deleted. Poetry went to a different level in that it did not, or at least what came through, did not specify such things as the Second Fusiliers or that, and it was an outlet for the clampdown on other writing. It was also a way of keeping the mind occupied, and I'll talk about this a little later, but when people had been in battle, when they'd been in trenches, very often in the calm that followed, or in some boring days in the trenches, or when shells were hitting other parts of the trenches, they could sit down and look around and write about what they saw. And finally, this was an age when groups of people sang. They sang in the pubs, the bars, they would sing in church, they would sing in groups, they would sing at rugby games, at football games. And many of these songs were penned at the time, but written to fit familiar tunes. And so someone sitting in a trench would say, "Hey boys, I've got a couple of lines of verse that fit such and such a tune. Maybe it's a long way to Tipperary, and I'm going." You see these waves changing because as troops arrive from different countries, they start out on a very high tone of here's the honor, here's the glory of war, and it changes as they experience war more. I think it helped to package the horror they faced. It was a way, in some ways, of distancing themselves from what was all around. They could put what they see and felt and experienced right down on a piece of paper. It brought some meaning, some connection with the poetry that they had memorized in their youth, tying them in with heroic acts of many years. So their suffering, one way to bring meaning to their suffering was to express it in poetry. By 1915, more poets are juxtaposing the beauty of nature, and it's being ravaged by war often, with the incongruous effects of war. There's a lot of German poetry of the war that has never been translated, but here's Kurt Adler writing in a poem from the observation post. And just this line gives you this sense of the distance. On that same evening, that soft, mild evening, 7 caps lay beside the lane, full of blood and dirt. And so here he's looking out. It was a day when it had started out beautiful, and then shells started to fall, people were killed, and then the evening, when the shells had stopped, and he's looking from his observation post to see if anyone is attacking from the other side, and there in the lane nearby he sees 7 caps of comrades, just the caps, full of mud and blood. And the poem written by Canadian war poet and surgeon John McCrae, written after a close friend had been killed nearby in Ypres, Belgium, and one that talks about poppies. I'm surprised at how many veterans who are giving poppies for donations around Veterans Day and Armistice Day don't know that the fields of Flanders, the fields of Gallipoli in Turkey, many battlefields during World War I, poppies sprouted up in the ground there, and you'd have sweeping fields of poppies where people enriched by the blood of many comrades and many enemies. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row. They mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And here you have this juxtaposition, this crashing cacophony between, on the one side, the beauty of the fields, and then the remembrance that all of this nature, all of the larks singing above, is happening while shells are falling, people are dying, cemeteries are being filled, and an adjutant to John McCrae, who was there at the time, said he was typifying the scene exactly as he saw it, as he sat there by his hospital tent. The wind that evening was blowing the poppies in the field. McCrae didn't write it for publication. He actually threw it away and someone else retrieved it, and it was published. McCrae died in 1917 from pneumonia caught during the war, not far from the front, but the poem became very popular, and still now we give the poppy out because poppies grew in Flanders fields. When German Zeppelins bombed England in 1915, the heiress of the Cunard fortunes was 19 or 20 years old, and Nancy Cunard is the other side of the coin to H.G. Wells' book about the wars where Zeppelins are dropping bombs, but that was written 7 or 8 years before, and she's writing in 1915. And she talks about what she experienced. And now she's not a soldier, but she's having first-hand experience of the war, and so in that sense becomes a war poet. I saw the people climbing up the street, maddened with war and strength and thoughts to kill, and after followed death, who held with skill his torn rags royally and stamped his feet. The fires flamed up and burnt the serried town, most where the sadder, poorer houses were. Death followed with proud feet and smiling stare, and the mad crowds ran madly up and down, and many died and hid in unfounded places in the black ruins of the frenzied night. And death still followed in his surplice, white and streaked with imitation of their faces. But in the morning, men began again to mock death, following in bitter pain. You have this same sense of the tragedy, the grit, the mud, the pain of war as it's actually happening in the events that are happening. By 1916, certainly, disillusionment with the war was more widespread, and in the character of the poetry reflects that change. Now, Wilfred Owen, who had never written poetry before the war, was affected by shell shock, was sent to a hospital in Scotland where he met the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was also suffering from shell shock, and they were being treated. Both of those men were sent back to the front after a period of treatment. Wilfred Owen writes of those who were suffering shell shock, and the words that he used so encapsulate what had happened and what he saw that they are still used to this day. Siegfried Sassoon writes much more sarcastically. He had fought right from the beginning, had been hospitalized because of shell shock, He met Wilfred Owen there. He had written poetry before the war, wrote poetry during the war, but as the war progresses through this period, he becomes more sarcastic about what is happening there. And this is reflected in his poem, Base Detail. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the best and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the roll of honor. Poor young chap, I'd say. I knew his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done, and youth stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed. So an American poet, part of the American Expeditionary Force in France, takes Rudyard Kipling's rhymes and meters from The Raven, quoth the Raven nevermore, and writes what is very typical of frontline poetry, taking something you know, taking a meter you know, taking the flow of a poem that you know, and rewriting it to fit the scene there. And this is by someone from Michigan. Through French noons and midnights dreary, while we pondered, mad and weary, over many lists of sailings in the duckboard's littered lore, our departure daily mapping, suddenly there came a tapping at our quarters door. Sailing orders sure, we shouted, sent into our quarters door. It was rumor, nothing more. Back into the quarters turning, all our souls within us burning, soon again we heard a tapping, something louder than before. Surely, said we, surely that is something with the news we're longing for. Let us see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let our hearts be still a moment. What for us is there in store? Pansani Zizen, yet some more. A bird called rumor roused us into hopeful humor. While we waited, word so slow, battery B, you're next to go. Nothing certain had been uttered, only duds our tired hearts fluttered. Till disgruntled off we muttered, other troops have gone before, and each mutter saw us questioning, as with waiting we were sore, Pontonizan evermore. Startled not by stillness broken, nor command we long forspoken, doubting much, but yet enduring antiseptic stunts of galore, models for some nude art master, while our microbes met disaster, following fast and followed faster, till our songs one burden bore. Will they ever take our forms from off the shore? Quoth our echo, wait some more. Then one day the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, yelled by messenger whose footfalls tinkled on the hobnailed floor. Yanks, he cried, a ship is sent thee, comfort in these orders lent thee, respite, and nepenthe from the memories of this shore. Shout, oh shout, one great hosanna, America forevermore, Ponsan Nizam nevermore. Soldier from Michigan, Alistair B. Alexander, a second lieutenant, wrote about the dirt and the flies of war, and I might say that lice were endemic, and nurses talk about lice even being on amputated limbs and continuing to thrive there. He writes, Alistair Alexander, of the flies of France. We tried them out on sulfur, but they seemed to like the smoke. They buzzed around and brought back millions more. We mixed 'em up some sugar and formaldehyde all, but they fattened up, marked lunchroom on our door. We got some Red Cross netting, didn't have to pay a cent, and tacked it over every hole and crack. 2 pulled apart the threads and let the rest come sailing through. We're still looking for the hole to chase them back. They're affectionate and friendly. They like to stick around in your stable, billet, kitchen, office mess. They know no union hours. You think they'll let you sleep. You're short of SOL. You miss your guess. When you crawl into your bunk and pull your blankets round your head and say, "Now I lay me down to sleep," you think you feel a cootie walking post along your spine. It's a fly that just came in to take a peek. They made dugouts in your sugar, perish nobly in your meat. Every meal you drink, café à la mouche. When you open up the jam pot, they come bussing tout de suite, and you wish you had anti-fly cartouche. Someday, when we go sailing home, way off in the by and by, where war is just something to forget, we'll all remember France, for here, ever-present fly, doggone the luck, they're pestering me yet. And this picks up so much of what the soldiers experienced in the war. The vermin, the lice, the flies, the maggots, the rats, some the size of cats. There were 2 species. One got quite big, and some others, all feasting on you and on the dead and on the food and the human waste. When people were sick and vomited, there were the flies, there were the lice. And when there was gangrene, there were the lice and the maggots and the flies chewing away at the human flesh. And this poem is almost sanitized compared with what they're seeing, but it's something at least that they could write home and send to the folks at home that could be appreciated for what they were experiencing day by day. That's a Michigan poem. Him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill when spring comes round again this year and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows, 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous.